Ladies and gentlemen, our beloved guests, I'd like to warmly welcome you to the center of MCC Transylvania at today's Transylvania Lecture. My name is István Péter, and I'm a colleague of the International Relations Department. Today's lecture received the title, Unmasking Morality in the Age of Relativism, because our guests will speak about the topic of moral imperatives, examining whether they are universally applicable or contextually specific. Philosophical traditions have historically identified certain moral principles as universal, unchanged by varying circumstances. However, there are also those moral imperatives that, while universal in essence, adapt in practice depending on specific situations and societal expectations. Beyond this, some moral imperatives are entirely contingent on the context in which they arise. Has the advent of moral relativism dismissed the ideas of universal morals? Please let me pass this question to our guest. First of all, Dr. Sebastián Morello is a philosopher, writer, lecturer, and public speaker. He studied philosophy and was trained by Sir Roger Scruton. He works as senior editor, editorial board member, and writer at the European Conservative, a journal of political and cultural criticism. The moderator of the lecture is going to be Mr. János Simon, theologist, lecturer at the Protestant Theological Institute of Kolozsvár, Cluj-Napoca. Thank you.
Thank you for your introduction. I wish you very warm welcome for this presentation and talk. We will start raising some questions and a short presentation. And later on we will continue with the discussion and we will open for the audience the Q&A. Dr. Morello, we had a talk this afternoon and you shared an experience a few years ago in Warsaw. And it was a starting point of something. Mm-hmm. Can you share what have you experienced there and what came afterwards? Your research, your new, fresh direction you took from your visit in Warsaw or afterwards. Well, if I want to be more scholarly, I would ask you to introduce us in the recent history of morality, how morality has changed in the past years or past decades, and how did you, or how do we arrive to give up moral imperatives and to embrace something else?
Okay.
Please, the word is yours.
All right. Okay. Should I use this? Is that yes?
Yes.
Okay. Good. I think that's on. So thank you very much. It's very nice to be here, to be with you. I love this country very much. This is my, I think, third or fourth visit here, and I come for the wonderful cities, the landscape, and probably above all the food and the wine. So it's great to be here with you, and I think what you're referring to regarding my visit in Warsaw was something I mentioned over lunch earlier, which was that I was invited there last year to give a talk at Congress 590, President Duda's annual Congress. I can't remember what I was talking on now, but hopefully it was mildly interesting. And I was walking through the city and I came across some graffiti, and somebody had spray painted BLM, Black Lives Matter. I had not seen any black people in Warsaw at that time. I know a little bit about the history of Poland. In fact, I'm quarter Polish. And the Poles were not implicated in the transatlantic slave trade. And I suddenly thought to myself, why has a protest or activistic movement that sprang up in America to address real or purported racial tensions that belong to that city, why does that now have an expression in the capital of Poland? In fact, it's not just there, it was all across Europe. It was in the United Kingdom. I looked at a map earlier today of places where there were Black Lives Matter protests in the United Kingdom in 2020, and one of the places was in the Scottish Highlands. Another was actually on the Orkney Islands, right up in the north, where the people up there aren't even Scottish; they're sort of Viking. Now the Vikings were definitely implicated in a slave trade, but not the transatlantic one. So I started to think, well, what's actually going on here? And I reflected on this question. So there's a story I used to tell my students when I taught in London, to try to encourage them to think about moral questions. And the story is this, that Major General Charles Napier was the chap who was setting up the hill stations around India during the British Raj there. And he once came across a village where they were cremating a man who had just died. And then they were bringing his wife to throw her onto the fire. And this is the practice of suti, that's an ancient practice in India. And he asked why this was happening. And his guide said, well, this is our practice. Our practice is that when a man dies, we burn his widow with him. And he said, okay, well, in Britain, when people burn an innocent woman alive, we hang all of those people. So you can follow your practice, and then we'll follow our practice. Now, this is not a very fashionable story, but I would tell this story to my students to try and get the reaction from them, to see what they would say. And some would say, well, maybe that is just a local practice and we're not supposed to judge. Others would say, well, maybe he was getting on to something that the people in India or in these villages had failed to acknowledge some kind of universal imperative or some negative precept. And others would say, well, the British should not have been there in the first place. And we would have a sort of discussion about this. Now, the really interesting question for me about this story is, he framed the discussion in terms of two conflicting cultural practices. But there's something about the story that's dishonest, because it seems to me that he was trying to insist that there was some negative precept that had not been acknowledged. Namely, if you kill an innocent person, then you are guilty of a crime that might deserve some kind of capital punishment. Now, traditionally speaking, there's always been a belief that there are negative, let's put it this way, there are moral imperatives that are best formulated negatively, and moral imperatives that are best formulated positively. Now, the negative ones are easy, because once you have a negative one, you don't need to think very much about the cultural or customary practices in order to acknowledge the practice. So, for example, do not steal. That's a negative precept. Do not steal. Okay, well, you don't need to think, oh, how do we culturally implement that? No, I mean, it's pretty obvious. You don't take other people's property. On the other hand, take a positive precept like honour your elders or honour your parents. Okay, how? How exactly do I do that? what is required of me to give sufficient honour to my elders or to my parents, or, for example, be patriotic, right? Love your nation. How? Does that mean I have to enroll in military service? Does that mean I have... What does it actually entail, practically speaking? Well, there isn't really an answer to that. That is worked out over the centuries through conversation, through custom, through habit. And so these are traditionally the ways we would distinguish between universal imperatives and how they were to be lived out. What does this all mean? It means that positive moral precepts or imperatives, because they are worked out by custom and by habit and by negotiation and conversation, they are very, very difficult during empire building. Because one of the problems with empire building is you are constantly developing political jurisdiction over people whose customs and habits and cultures you don't really understand and to which you have been exposed for a very short period of time. And so what you get are new forms of ethical negotiation developing, particularly in the 18th and 19th centuries. And by the 19th century, what's very popular in England is utilitarianism. And utilitarianism is a calculation and outcome-based conception of ethics. You know that your action is ethical, or it's right, or it's correct, because it has the right outcomes. And all you need to do is calculate what the outcome would be of this or that action. Now, part of the problem with utilitarianism is that it is structurally insatiable. What I mean by that is that whatever you are doing, you have to work out whether it is going to have the desired outcome. So you might think, well, I'm going to have a cup of tea now. Well, immediately you have to ask yourself, could I be doing something else at this moment that would have a better outcome than if I were to use this time having a cup of tea? And so constantly there is an imperative to be calculating every single time whether what you're doing is bringing about the best income. And it was pointed out quite early on that such thinking could actually have give rise to terrible actions. The example I gave earlier over lunch was it is possible to try and calculate how long the Earth might exist for, reasonably speaking, how long human beings might exist on the Earth, taking into account ongoing prosperity and all sorts of things, and then try and calculate how much suffering is entailed by that over the course of the rest of the existence of the world, and then see whether, if you were to kill everyone today, that suffering would be less than the accumulated suffering over the centuries to come, and if so, on utilitarian grounds, perhaps the best thing you could possibly do at this moment is to, let's say, give everybody a lethal injection. So it's both insatiable and it's progressive in the worst kind of ways. What's interesting is that utilitarianism developed on the grounds that it could overcome custom and prejudice, but when the fact that it could give rise to very serious and egregious actions was raised when Bentham was writing. Jeremy Bentham, one of the great instrumentalist, consequentialist thinkers, and he famously said, "Well, no Englishman would behave in that way." Well, that's not a utilitarian argument; that's a prejudice. So it's quite interesting that they never quite got over custom and prejudice in that way. In any case, utilitarian thinking became the fashionable moral thinking in the age of empire building. There were very important utilitarian thinkers in Belgium. Kaiser Wilhelm was totally enamored by utilitarian thinking. And it really reaches its climax in the 20th century when you have people committing the greatest atrocities on utilitarian grounds. There is actually a passage in Adolf Hitler's Mein Kampf in which he says, well, if you could unite everyone on earth under a single political regime, and it was a single ethnic population or a single race under a single government with a single ideological worldview, then you could secure ongoing happiness for all ages to come, because all conflict is reduced to these differences. Well, that's perfect utilitarian thinking. Now, what you get is, interestingly enough, among the Allied nations, France, the United States, the United Kingdom, is an admixture of utilitarian thinking and liberal rights claims. Now, this is very interesting because rights claims that emerges obviously in early liberal thinking, this develops almost exclusively in relation to utilitarian thinking. As Nigel Bigger writes in What's Right with Wrongs, his wonderful conservative critique of rights, rights thinking really emerges out of fear. And in the latter half of the 20th century, that kind of rights thinking triumphs, and you get the Court of Human Rights, you get the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, you get this incredible, almost infinite right speak, largely because people look at the kind of outcome claims that were made during the first half of the 20th century, and they say, what on earth can we say to protect ourselves against utilitarian and consequentialist thinking reaching its furthest extrapolation? And so they say, well, there are these claims that are inherent to human nature that we can make. So that's a kind of whistle-stop tour of the overview. What this means is that in the post-war period, what we've ended up doing is having capitalized on rights think, the utilitarian thinking is now fighting back. One of the really interesting examples of this is specifically in the Black Lives Matter protests. So, I was watching videos at the time of Black Lives Matter riots going through London, and people are smashing up shop windows and they're setting fire to public monuments and just absolute chaos. Well, how in good conscience can people do that? Well, it's outcome thinking. We are part of the progressive emancipation of an underclass in this society, and so whatever we do today is justified because of this very righteous ethical outcome that we are currently pursuing. And on what grounds are they doing that? Well, the rights of those people have not been acknowledged. So now what you get is this very interesting admixture of liberal rights claims with utilitarian thinking. And nearly all moral conversations in the West oscillate between these two. This has become admixed with late neo-Marxist academic discourse on historical progress being the emancipation of an underclass from a kind of predatory elite. And so the kind of liberal rights claims and the utilitarian outcome claims that contemporary ethicists are trying to make are all now placed within a historical understanding of the arch of history, of progress, as ongoing emancipation. And pretty much all moral conversations, all moral discourse are framed within these terms now. I find it very interesting when you listen to debates between people who are pro-life and people who are pro-abortion. So the pro-life person will make some kind of rights claim about the baby and say, well, all rights are contingent on the right to life. If you're not alive, you can't have any rights, and therefore, you know, the right to life is the fundamental, elementary right, and so you definitely can't attack the right to life, and this baby must have a right to life. And then the utilitarian comes along and says, well, hold on a minute. What about the outcomes? What about a woman who's been raped, or, you know, she had a whole life ahead of her, and now suddenly you're going to just let her life be destroyed? And have you really considered the outcomes of what you're arguing for? And then the pro-lifer argues a utilitarian point and says, well, you know, you might kill Beethoven or the next Shakespeare. You know, you can't possibly do this. And then the pro-abortion person makes a rights claim argument and says, well, what about the right to bodily autonomy? What about the right of self-determination? And the debate just oscillates constantly between these two schools of thinking. And what this all indicates, to me at least, is that we have lost a sense of the nature of moral imperative per se. We don't really know what a moral imperative is anymore. And again, you know, it was seeing that spray paint on the wall in Warsaw that sort of got me thinking about this. And again, I think that the BLM phenomenon is a really fascinating one, precisely because it's illustrative of the fact that we've lost a sense of what moral imperative or the nature of a moral imperative or a precept actually is. So if you think, for example, the negative precept, do not kill innocent people, was in most philosophical and traditional schools considered to be universal, right? Now, in almost all discourse, public discourse, we talk about it as if it's conditional. Well, it depends on the state of the conception, what's happened, whether the person has been raped, how they know each other. There are a huge number of conditions that you need to take seriously in order to know whether you can kill an innocent person or not. At the same time, a movement like Black Lives Matter, which is considered by most reasonable people to be something very conditional and culturally specific, because America has a very, very specific history of racial tension in a way that, say, Poland does not, or the Orkney Islands does not, that is now considered to be a universal positive imperative. And every nation on earth must in some way take that and make it their own, or make something analogical to it and make it their own. Well, that's completely confused, in my opinion. And it is illustrative of the fact that we have lost any sense of what a moral imperative or a moral precept actually is. So that, I think, is the sad history of how we got to the kind of ethical confusion we've got to. It's a very superficial history. That's because I promised I'd be done in 20 minutes. But that, I think, is what's happened. Don't all now start drinking whiskey and shooting yourselves, because it's I think there are solutions, but that I think is roughly where we are now, and I don't think either utilitarian or consequentialist arguments or liberal rights-based arguments or a progressive neo-Marxist conception of history onto which these have now both become parasitic are the way in which to have mature ethical conversations. So that's where I was exactly 20 minutes, so that's how I'm going to stop.
Thank you. I heard many interesting thoughts, and I don't know if I'm right or wrong, but in my mind, all the time utilitarianism was connected to be interpreted something contextually. Not being available, a certain imperative to every human being, but interpreted the human being or morality very contextual, very connected to the I, the first person singular. And now what I hear that it's quite the opposite way. It's connected to empire building, utilitarianism, it's strongly connected to that idea. Could you tell us a little bit more on this question? How my perception or way of thinking earlier was right or was wrong, or something in the meantime has changed in moral philosophy that as you interpret it's quite the opposite way?
Well, in a sense it is contextual insofar as utilitarians are always dealing with the concrete problem that they're facing. As I say, I mean, John Stuart Mill, who, if you like, is a kind of utilitarian emancipationist thinker par excellence, there he is working as a secretary in the office of the British East India Company, thinking, well, you know, we need to build this railway track or whatever it is. You know, we might have to bulldoze a few 2,000-year-old Hindu temples, which might cause a bit of a ruckus. But in the end, you know, if the outcome is that there's greater prosperity and there is greater trade and the movement of subcontinental Indians and so on, then we're going to have to make those kinds of calculations. So in that sense, to say is it a concrete thing or is it a universalist ethic is a bit of a false dichotomy, because it is an attempt to find an ethic that can be applied to the concrete but simultaneously bypasses customary thinking and tradition and all of those things, within which it was generally thought positive imperatives unfold. So that's why you can understand why utilitarian thinking became the house ethic of the early 20th century. I mean, by the way, when I quoted the younger Adolf Hitler in Mein Kampf earlier, I don't think he came to that conclusion because he was a great devotee of Mill and Bentham. This kind of thinking is in the drinking water at that period, and it's considered completely reasonable at that time to be making those kind of consequentialist arguments.
Okay, and if we arrive to the present, I like all the time to depart from the present to have a clear view, because we can interpret past much clearly, and we can interpret our context maybe. But if we switch back to the present, can we say that Black Lives Matters, for example, or other utilitarian interpretation or morality is a kind of empire building process, or is that right? How do you see that?
Sorry, I don't think I understand the question. Go on.
Yeah.
Develop it a little bit.
If we say that in the past empire building was strongly connected, or became the house philosophy, utilitarianism became the house philosophy of empire building. If nowadays we take certain utilitarianist approaches, we can say that even today there is an empire building around us, present in our society.
Yeah. Well, I certainly think that in the age in which we live, we are contending with globalist movements, and those movements do themselves have a progressivist conception of history. I mean, you have to think that if the genealogy of dominant moral theories that got us into the public discourse that we're in today are the ones that I've suggested they are, every single one of those have two features. One, they're structurally insatiable, and two, they're progressivist. In the technical sense of the word, that they exist to emancipate. You think that if you have I've suggested how that's the case with utilitarianism, but if you think about liberal rights-based ethics, if people have inherent rights that are not being acknowledged, then the regime that has not acknowledged them is on the wrong side of history, to use a common liberal phrase, right? And sooner or later, we'll discover that it wasn't with the American Yankees, it was with the Confederates. It wasn't with the Allies, it was with the Nazis the whole time. And that regime, so that regime, there's an imperative on the liberal rights-based regime to always be adding to rights all the time, and always be finding new rights of gender, new rights of self-determination. The American Supreme Court in the late 90s declared that it is a human right for every individual to define the universe, right? I mean, I can't even define my breakfast, I don't know how I'm going to define the universe, right? But this is now an inherent right, and if a regime isn't declaring that to be the case, then it may very well find itself in the bin with all of the other regimes that we have declared post hoc to be evil and on the wrong side of history. So utilitarianism is insatiable, rights-based ethics is insatiable, and the neo-Marxist conception of history as ongoing emancipation is insatiable. When Marx and Engels wrote the Communist Manifesto, and I'm not saying that both of them envisaged all the consequences of their thinking, and it's hard for me not to be sympathetic to Engels because he was a very keen fox hunter. But in general, the two of them, the Communist Manifesto is the only work I know of, at least, written or co-authored by Marx, in which he actually gives a vision of what society would look like once the bourgeois tyranny has been destroyed and you have the absolute emancipation of the proletariat. And he says, well, people will attend to their small holdings in the morning, they'll go hunting and fishing in the afternoon, and then they'll retire for literary criticism in the evening, right? So it turns out that once you've destroyed the bourgeoisie and emancipated the proletariat, everyone becomes bourgeois, right? And until that actually happens, you haven't actually achieved the kind of reconciliation of history that entire historical schema promises. So every single level of the current moral paradigm is progressivist structurally, which is why the great power holders of globalist operations today are constantly talking about being on the right side of history. It's not just a catchphrase. They're terrified that they're going to end up in the bin with all of the oppressors of history, right? Now, when you have a system that is both insatiable and progressivist, that system can never stop. Structurally speaking, it can never stop. There is no aspect of reality which it can leave alone. If it does that, it's already doing something unjust according to its own lights. Well, that is a total recipe for the kind of weird admixture of totalitarianism and authoritarianism, which is now rearing its head in almost every country in the West. And that's the kind of ethical or quasi-ethical structure that I'm suggesting we need to get away from.
If I intentionally want to simplify what you said, can we say that utilitarianism brings to totalitarianism?
Utilitarianism leads to totalitarianism. Well, I'm not sure if it necessarily has to. But I certainly think that if it is combined with if you like, some kind of empire-building ethic where you have to bring this to every single land on Earth. I mean, it's interesting that, you know, until the American collapse in Afghanistan, the American government was still funding the establishment of research institutes in Afghanistan for gender studies, right? Nobody in Afghanistan wants to study gender studies, okay? Nobody cares about gender studies in Afghanistan, right? But if you combine these modern moral paradigms with an expansionist mindset that actually, if you cannot allow unjust regimes to exist anywhere, and so this needs to be in every corner of the world, then that's what you're going to end up with. You're going to end up with a kind of, as I said, a globalist admixture of authoritarianism and totalitarianism.
I have a personal experience on this issue. When I started a PhD some 13 years ago in the Netherlands, I was strongly forced to took up some questions which were not my questions. I was forced to develop a research in the direction of gender studies, but I didn't want to do that. And when I was arguing against, the professors told me that this is the future. You have to go on that direction if you want to take the good part of the history, to be on the right side of the history. You have to go like that. You don't have to remain in your tradition because your culture is like that, very traditionalist. You have to pick up something which is the future.
Yes, yes.
And I had a very strong feeling against doing this.
Yes.
That I couldn't accept.
Right, right. Well, I mean, when some years ago, I was appointed in a senior academic post in Princeton University over in New Jersey. And before I even started the job, I received a disciplinary email because I had not declared my preferred pronouns. And I sort of said, well, you know, could you look at me and guess what my pronouns are? And when I asked for an explanation because I thought that this was so bizarre to be asked this, and I received an email describing the arch of history, that we need to be on the right side of history and we need to be progressing all the time. So this is not a kind of little niche academic interest. This is in the administrative staff of universities. This is in the programs for most university students. I mean, in the UK, we now have 45% of our population going to university, right? Because Tony Blair insisted that we wouldn't progress as a nation unless everyone had tertiary education. One, I think that that's a big mistake, but two, these students are certainly not all going and being lectured to by, the research students of Roger Scruton, right? So this is completely in the drinking water now. And do you have that phrase, in the drinking water? Yeah, okay. And so there are two things here, I suppose, I'm getting at, which is that the entire moral discourse, because of its genealogy, is now oscillating between what were previously schools in tension with one another, and they are both framed within two principles. One is progress, the historical arch of progress, and two is in universalism. And both of these, I think, undermine what ethical discourse is all about, and I genuinely really hold that the solutions are in a tradition-based conception of ethics and a localist conception of ethics. So literally the opposite of what I think frames the entire discussion. But we can talk a little bit about that if you like. But
I would like you to develop the traditionalist and the localist, you said. What it means to be traditionalist and what it means to be localist.
Well, as I said, I think that apart from certain negative prohibitions, you should not do this, formulated as such. Most of ethical discourse is about what we are obligated to do, okay? And I think what we are obligated to do is worked out within a community. It actually belongs to concrete relations. And the kind of pieties and the kind of things we owe to each other, and what's happening to people in my family, what's happening to people on my street, what's happening to... just to give you one example. Presumably, have you all heard of Peter Singer? Is that the name that means anything to you? So he's a professor of ethics. He was going to be my colleague at Princeton, but he's a professor of ethics at Princeton. In a very, very famous paper, of course, his name I've forgotten, in the late 1990s, he wrote an argument that has become incredibly influential in the tertiary sector, so in charities and NGOs across the world. And what he argues in that paper is that moral imperatives are not geographically dependent. Okay? So, the starving woman in Kenya does not make a claim any more or any less than the equally starving woman who lives next door to me. Okay? Morality is not geographically dependent. And because he argues that that's the case, he says, so how can we actually live morally? And his solution is, well, we can give to multinational charities who will be able to distribute our wealth to as many people as need it, and therefore we can be morally righteous. We can live morally righteously. And so the moral life in a globalized world is contingent on the existence of these kinds of charities. Well, these kinds of charities love this paper, right? And Peter Singer is a senior advisor to all of these charities. Well, I just do not accept the premise. I don't accept the premise. I think that I have a moral relation with the woman next door, which I do not have with the woman in Kenya. There is a proximity of moral implication that I share with people on my street that I don't share with people on the next street, or in the whole town, or in the whole nation, or in the whole world. That actually part of not being an abstraction in some platonic world, but being a concrete human being with a body living in a particular place with a particular set of people, that is morally relative. Okay? And so these universalist conceptions of ethics are ones whose premises I simply do not accept. And that is why I think we need to, that moral discourse, and it's very difficult in a world where most people carry out their discussions and their debates through social media and all of these sorts of things, and people are becoming more and more atomized through new technologies. But I think that moral discourse needs to be resituated in local commitments. And I think that is the only way out of this kind of thinking. I know, positively speaking, it might be a lot easier to know what I shouldn't do, but I know what I have to do because I know the kinds of expectations that people have of me with whom I'm surrounded. And that is really, I think, where this needs to go. And that means that we're going to have to start talking, and I think there's an obligation on philosophers and intellectuals and teachers to start talking about human flourishing much more in these kinds of terms. You know, Simone Weil, the famous French philosopher, she talked in a book called The Need for Roots, all about this notion that the moral intuition unfolds out of the kind of concrete obligations we have when we're rooted in a community, in a tradition, in our historical consciousness, and so on. And that is, I think, the solution to the kind of chaotic moral paradigm in which we found ourselves. Just to give you an example, look, I'm not here to make the pro-abortion argument or the pro-life argument or anything like that, but I think that the question of abortion is a really interesting moral issue where a lot of lucidity emerges because it's so grave and important. And I'll just give you one example. International Planned Parenthood, which is the largest abortion provider in the world, has found it really, really difficult to establish abortion clinics in Africa. And in fact, it became so difficult that at one point Barack Obama, when he was president, said that he would suspend foreign aid to Africa unless they would accept having abortion clinics, right? Which I think is amazing. You know, he thought in terms of the arch of progress, right? Unless you're prepared to have abortions, we're not going to give you food, right? It's a kind of weird argument, but that was kind of part of American influence. Now, why has it been so difficult to establish abortion clinics in Africa? Africa, I used to live in Africa. I've lived in South Africa, in Kenya, and in Zambia. And I love Africa. I don't love it as much as Transylvania, but I love Africa. And I have spent a lot of time there. And there are so many dialects in Africa, thousands of dialects. And none of them, as far as I know, this is what I've been told, have a positive or a morally neutral term for abortion. None of them. For them, you know, to destroy the unborn child of a woman is like an act of war, right? It's what your enemies do to you. It's just, they have no word for this that makes it sound like a morally neutral thing or even a positive thing. Now, why is that? Well, morality in Africa has largely been worked. These are very tight-knit traditional communities, and they might have all sorts of moral problems, but that's not one that they've had to deal with. And so it's very interesting that all of those kinds of imperatives have been worked out locally through local discourse. Now, it seems to me that International Planned Parenthood cannot get a foothold there simply because it's coming into conflict with that kind of traditional morality, localist traditional morality. International Planned Parenthood is making arguments that are universalist about outcomes, about the dignity of people, about women's rights to education, to self-realization, to autonomy, to agency, and they're coming into contact with people who are making arguments that are like this, but that's not what we do. And they're saying, well, that's not an argument. Yeah, but that's not what we do. We discuss these things, and that's not what we do. Mm-hmm. It's very interesting. So now, again, if you want to know my views on abortion, I can tell you those, but that's not really what I'm interested in. What I'm interested in is how we get out of a progressivist, universalist paradigm. And that's seems to me the way. I'm by the way, I don't like what happened during COVID with the lockdowns and everything. But one thing I thought was really interesting is that a lot of people in the UK, they ended up spending a lot more time with their families. They ended up moving back to the villages where they grew up. And I don't know if it was people claim that whatever was happening during COVID was a kind of globalist conspiracy. Maybe, but in many ways it went wrong if that's true, because some interesting things happened, and because of that, this might actually be exactly the right time to be making these kinds of localist, organicist arguments for reframing moral discourse.
This is my last question, and I will open for the debate. As a theologian, I'm used to have imperatives coming from the scripture, for example, God's proclamation. You said that moralism has to be negotiated locally, and it needs some certain imperatives. I'm sure that you were thinking about what would be in a British context, those imperatives. Can you give us a few examples
of
imperatives nowadays which is needed in a British context?
Well, I mean, certainly there are certain hot topics at the moment in Great Britain. One of which is immigration. So we have a huge number of illegal immigrants coming to England at the moment, onto the shores in Kent and in the south of England. And every single government promises that it's going to address this topic and then doesn't. And currently the way the government deals with this is it brings these people safely to shore. The European Court for Human Rights in Strasbourg has said that that's what you have to do. And there may be truth to that. There are children on board and so on. There's also a big problem with that, because if you do that, you incentivize children making these very dangerous journeys. Many of them drown on the way. So there's a compassion-based argument in both directions. But in any case, what we do at the moment is, and then we put them in hotels in the Midlands in England, and the taxpayer is currently paying collectively over £6 million. So I know you don't have euros here, but that's sort of 6.5 million euros a day in order to accommodate illegal immigrants in hotels in the Midlands. The English communities in those towns are becoming increasingly upset, because there have been many rape incidents of young British girls by newly arrived immigrants who are now living in hotels in these towns. They're unhappy. When they protest, the British press accuse them of being far-right racists. And so this is a very hot topic, and it will probably define the next election in the middle of 2024. And after 13 years, the Conservative government will probably be pushed out. And in my opinion, good riddance. It is a party that is Conservative only in name and nothing else. So these are kind of very hot topics. Again, I find it very interesting that these conversations are beginning to happen in a localist context. Right? What is happening to our communities? What are happening to our villages? Right? In Leicestershire last year, the Muslim community and the Hindu community fell out with each other. Now, the Muslim community and the Hindu community together make up 65% of the town. So the largest city in the East Midlands in England is now just over 30% English, right? And if you watch the videos, it's kind of amazing. The whole city got turned into a battleground where Muslims and Hindus were attacking each other. And you can just see videos of the English inhabitants of this city just standing by watching in amazement, having to come to terms with the fact that their city was no longer their home, really. And there are a lot of British people who even would define themselves as liberals or progressives who are saying, what the hell is going on here? So I find it very interesting that there's now, whether we like it or not, a moral discourse emerging based on localism and local commitments and pieties and the kinds of things that I think it should be based on. So I'm sorry that it's had to come to this in order for people to start thinking reasonably again, but that's what seems to be unfolding.
Can you just name shortly some other issues which should be...
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of conversation at the moment in the UK about woke. BLM is obviously part of that. There's a huge amount of ideology going right down to the primary schools now. So there's a lot of conversations going on in schools with children as young as 5 or 6, asking them to decide what gender they are and all of this kind of thing. There are a lot of parents who are just getting really fed up with this. We home educate our children, and we do that because our children were in the local Church of England school, and a lot of this kind of woke ideology was being implemented in that school. I took on the school. I insisted that all the books be withdrawn, and they were for 1 year, but then they were put back. Interestingly enough, all the Eastern Europeans who were living there, who had children in the school, I became their hero when I did this. So that was nice too. But there are these kinds of conversations developing. Conversations that I think would have been too unfashionable only 5 years ago, but it's now creeping into the public arena. Government doesn't like it, the press don't like it. The elite class do not like the fact that this is the conversation that is emerging, and they're trying to suppress it all the time. But that is what is happening.
And the second part of my question will be, this is the 4th time you are visiting Transylvania or Romania, and what do you think, what should be a moral imperative in our context? I enjoy all the time I am moving to another context to observe what is happening there, and it makes me all the time to rethink my own context. What do you think of us?
Well, as I said, I'm hugely fond of this country. My own view is that Romania as a country missed a trick. It could have been, sorry to put it like this, but it could have been Europe's safari. You know, you have these kind of incredible temperate forests that go on forever. You have these amazing sort of little Gothic villages and towns with cobbled streets. Two-thirds or three-quarters of all of Europe's large mammals are in this country. You have lynx, you have bear, you have elk. You have it's just an amazing country, and I think Romania should have opened itself up to the tourist market in a way that it never did. It's very interesting that the Romanian cultural institute in this country, Mihai Institute. I think there are 3 or 4 main charities that are to do with either architecture or culture or historical projects in this country, and every single one of them was founded by an English person. That's not good. It indicates to me that there is insufficient cultural confidence in this country. And I actually see this, there are a lot of countries in Europe that are like this. Ireland is like this. Italy is like this. These countries have insufficient cultural confidence, and there's no reason to be like that. If the inhabitants of those countries actually looked around and saw what a remarkable land they could call their own, that just simply wouldn't be the case. And politically, that's very important, because if you don't have that kind of confidence, then the elites of those countries increasingly feel that they have to impress their Northern European overlords, and they have to impress the European Parliament. They have to, and then of course all of the fashionable motivations and agendas of those institutions are ones they're constantly trying to prove they're on board with them as well. Yeah, and this is why I've done a lot of work with the Hungarians. I've done a lot of work with Poland, and I'm very encouraged by these countries that are actually slamming the brakes on all of that and saying, well, no, that's, we're proud of who we are and so on. So, I would love to see this country become a much more confident one. And I know this is a very controversial point, so forgive me, but in re-establishing or establishing that kind of confidence, I would love to see a kind of some kind of reconciliation of the Hungarian minority in this country that has such an important story to tell with the Romanian population, because I think you have an equal claim to this land, and that confidence needs to be reasserted together. But I don't want to say anything to upset anyone, so.
We won't be, because it's good to see ourselves with other eyes, or being critical. It needs to be critical with yourselves as well. The debate is open. If you have question, I think we have another microphone. You can ask for it.
Just a glass of beer then, I suppose.
Media, sorry,
Thank you. Great presentation. I have a question related to what kind of path do you see for the upcoming morality? You present a short history of what's happened, and how do you see the future of morality?
Well, as I say, I think that, look, the progressive conception of history is one I don't believe in. I don't think that there is a direction to history. I think that history is dynamic. We today are very used to conflating technological progress with moral progress, right? But just because I have an iPhone in my pocket, that doesn't actually mean that I'm more morally integrated than my ancestors in any way, right? But we conflate these things all the time. Thousands of PhD theses are written every year on Shakespeare, but we can't produce another Shakespeare, right? To me, the idea that we are a kind of more integrated, we might not be less so. I think we are, but we may not be. But I don't see history as having a direction. If you had gone into a primary school in the 1890s in England and asked the boys what is it to be English? They would have said, it's the best thing in the world. You know, we own a third of the entire world. The sun cannot set on our empire. To be English is to win first prize in the lottery of life. That's what they would have said, right? If you had told them that by the age of 35, they would all be dead face down on no man's land in Normandy or in Belgium, they just wouldn't have believed it, right? In fact, if you had told me in 2019 that we were all going to be locked down for 2 years because of a cough, right? I just simply wouldn't have believed it. History is totally dynamic. It doesn't have a direction. And so we were told that we were entering a post-history age, that things were getting more global, more free movement of peoples, that everything was going to become just one big open world. And yet, here we have re-emerging all over the place, localist arguments, the reassertion of national belonging. It's happening everywhere. No liberal American in the 1990s could have seen a Trump president coming. These things are just, they're not foreseeable. So it would be very foolish for me to make predictions about the future, saying what I've just said. But I am encouraged by the fact that there is, that localist, organicist, tradition-based arguments are re-emerging in the public discourse, whether the global elites like it or not. That, to me, is an encouraging thing. And I hope it continues.
There was another.
Thank you.
Thank you. Living in an age of relativism where different concepts are interrelated, for instance, relativism with open society, and where local and global moral issues or moral values are interrelated, as you argued, along with local moral values with a global outlook. I would like to hear your opinion about the meta-narratives of our ages. Even if those meta-narratives in some cases could be very tragic, like the war, or the concept of nation. How do you see this in our relativized, globalized world where some kinds of meta-colonial tendencies are developing, talking about migration and the examples in Great Britain where different countries are taking over the majority of a certain city, the population of a certain city. So how do you see the meta-narratives, and how do you interpret the meta-narratives from the perspective of the ethics?
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. Well, it's very interesting, but a very complicated question. If you like, what's happened in post-modernity or late modernity, which is really one of its defining features, is that it's moving away from principle and moving into narrative-based morality. And so this is both a great advantage and disadvantage for the conservative, because he has to fight in that arena of competing stories. But it's an advantage because the conservative likes to tell stories. That's what conservatives like to do. They like to tell stories of the nation, of how it developed, of who we are as a people, etc., etc. That's what conservatives are good at. So it's an interesting time. What is slightly worrying is that what's happening with the younger generation, so the generations that came after the millennials, is that, particularly through social media, there's a massive cynicism developing, where almost every bit of information that is disseminated is treated through a hermeneutic of suspicion. So that is very interesting, because that almost makes a narrative-based discourse impossible. So it will be very, very interesting to see what happens in the next 20, 30 years with the entire paradigm of meta-narratives, when you have a generation that's been raised to be suspicious of everything. So we shall have to see.
If there are other questions, maybe? The last question.
I would like to ask the both of you, we kind of live in a bubble here in Transylvania, all the BLM and woke, at least among my friends, it's not a topic. Will the bubble ever burst? Will the Western hot topics ever come here to us?
Please.
Let me start. I was asked by my students in 2020 about some issues, and I said that these issues are not our issues, at least for the next 10 years. And after 2 months, I had to reconsider myself, because in a very short period, all those issues entered into our discussion, social discussion. So I'm not sure if it's not our issue, because I'm thinking to the teenagers. In many cases, I hear them talking about those issues, BLM, for example, because they are watching TikTok videos, and all those issues raised somewhere else on this globe are touching them. So maybe not the issue of the 20 plus or 30 plus, but if we take a look to our children or young people, I think that they are not escaping all those global issues. But
yes, I'm afraid I'm inclined to agree with you. So it's probably time for me to fess up to something. My wife is from Bucharest, and she tells me that at least that part of Romania is always a decade behind in terms of the fashionable discourse. What's interesting about what's happening in the West is that we're already post-woke, basically. As I said, those who are coming into the universities now have all that, they are. What's the term? That's right. They're tech natives. That's the phrase. They're tech natives. They most of their relationships are conducted through social media. Most of their information comes through videos. Most of their entertainment is through TikTok. They treat, in their mind, the virtual is more real than the actual. And this has given rise to extreme degrees of cynicism. They see the world, by cynicism I mean in the most literal sense of the term, they see the world as something from which you retreat in order to find where you're really comfortable, where your true self is, which is your online avatar and the avatars that you interface with, right? So these people are not progressives. They don't have a theory of progress at all. They don't think anything's getting better. They think you have to fly from reality, right? So we are already in post-woke. In Bucharest, I get the impression they're about 3 years pre-woke. Okay. And so you've got all of those debates and all of the tattoos and all the blue hair to come, but that hasn't happened yet. So I hope I hope that you can look over at the misery of the West today and decide to choose a different path. But you may just have to learn it all for yourselves, I'm afraid. But that's the information I have anyway.
I would like to add another argument. Maybe at the level of our society, those are not real issues nowadays. But if we take a look into the media, we have in media certain articles on those issues connected to our country. And it's not a huge amount as in the West, but we are facing already some kind of attitude switch or way of thinking switch, slow by slow. A few weeks ago, Nigel Biggar from Oxford visited the MCC lectures. Some of you maybe remember that, and he shared his story. And he never thought that at Oxford could happen something like happened with him personally. That he had written an article defending a statue. One of the founders, I think, of the Oxford University.
Cecil Rhodes.
Yeah.
Cecil Rhodes.
And he got tagged, and he was arguing with facts, historical facts, and he said that he never thought that scientists, professors at Oxford, would say that doesn't matter. Mm-hmm. As a scientist, you have to have a different attitude. You work with facts, and as a researcher, you cannot just overlook the facts. And in that fight, this had happened. That history doesn't matter. A certain attitude matters. That we have to switch. We have to be progressive, and you have to disappear with your attitude or with your view of or your interpretation, and that has happened quite recently.
Well, part of the problem with the rights-based liberal ethic that I talked about earlier is that sooner or later you have to ask yourself, where do these rights actually come from? Now, I mentioned Biggar's book, What's Wrong with Rights, earlier, which I think is one of the best conservative critiques of rights-based ethics. He argues that rights are actually, what we call rights, are actually a way of articulating the kind of expectations that we develop over centuries within communities, which I think is probably correct. What's interesting about the liberal paradigm of rights is that when you start asking where on earth these rights come from, who allocates them, if they're innate, where are they generated from, how do you infer from human nature these kinds of moral claims, etc., etc. When you start doing that, what you end up doing is necessarily reducing rights-based ethics to the therapeutic. Because in the end, the kind of moral claims you're making about reality are reducible to how you perceive yourself and how you perceive how people should treat you and how you should be able to operate in the world. And so it necessarily gets reduced to the therapeutic. Once you have accepted that, then you get the kind of discourse that you saw in Oxford, where people say things like, well, your words are violence. Traditionally in the West, we always made a distinction between words and violence, and the distinction was there are certain words that are incitement to violence. Those are illegal, right? If you're actually telling people to go and kill people, that is when words become a species of violence. Outside of that, words can't be violence. But once all moral discourse has been reduced to the therapeutic, if you say, well, yes, it's true the British are implicated in the transatlantic slave trade of the 19th century. As a nation, as a corporate person, it's implicated. But I also think it redeemed itself by policing the seas for 70 years in order to stop slavery and incurring so much debt in order to stop the transatlantic slave trade and the slave trade by other nations, that we were actually paying off that debt until 1998, right? And that was a way that it actually redeemed itself. If I make that historical argument, my interlocutor only needs to say, what you've just said hurts me, and they've won the debate. They've won the discussion, right? Because I've just, by making a historical case, I have carried out an act of violence against that person. Once you're in that discourse, and sorry guys, it's just round the corner for you, that discourse, this whole moral public discourse becomes almost impossible. And that's what's really terrifying. So, the question is, how do you slam on the brakes? And what I have tried to suggest to you, and you've listened very patiently, what I've tried to suggest to you this evening is that the way you slam on the brakes is by localizing public discourse, by localizing moral understanding, and that means rediscovering your history, rediscovering what it is to belong, your local community, your traditions, and inducting yourself very, very deeply into that. The only way out, I'm afraid, is conservatism, with a small c.
I think it's a good word for end this discussion, because we run out of time. Thank you for being here, and thank you for this presentation. And thank you for letting us to see what is behind the mask of morality. Thank you for the audience, for your presence, and for your questions.